Thanks for staying so late. I'm happy to be able to share some of the work that we do in the lab and a little bit about how we fit into the energy space. So I think I was asked to go over several things to accomplish in this talk. One was introduce myself. I think part of this is to kind of get to know the faculty doing energy things, and then talk a little about what we're doing in the research in the lab, but also sort of tie it back to sort of energy fundamentals. So hopefully we'll try to accomplish all of those things. So the overview is a little bit about myself and what I do. Big picture view, which I'll kind of piggyback on what David had just talked about for the energy use and impact globally and in the US. The role of biology in the global energy system currently, and then prioritization of problems that I like to focus on because I think of their importance in the space. And then a couple different examples of some projects ongoing in the lab that relate to these energy problems. So a little about myself and what I do. So I'm a biochemical engineer by training. So what does that mean? That means we basically try to engineer biological solutions, biocatalysts to solve problems, right? And so that means for me in the lab is we basically make biological catalysts. So these are microbial cells, enzymes that basically convert different things to other different things. So in this case, renewable sugars, if you think about biofuels, carbon dioxide as a feedstock, natural gas, other feedstocks as well. And then converting those to a variety of things. So on the biomedical side of things, I have a lot of folks interested in sort of designer bioactives, natural products, pharmaceuticals. We have some work that's spanning into nanomaterials, as well as chemicals, specialty chemicals, bulk chemicals, and even biofuels, right? So quite a big space. And what we work on is broken down into kind of a lot of big areas. So the first one being technology. So how do we build these biocatalysts? How do we do that rapidly? How do we understand how to design them? And then that really breaks into three different areas. So we work on enzyme engineering. So those are actually the little molecules inside the cells that convert these different substrates into feedstocks and into different products. Metabolic pathway engineering. So pathway is basically a group of different enzymes working together to do something. And then what I call phenotype engineering, which is how do you get cells that don't like to do what you want them to like to do what you want them to do, right? That's actually probably the hardest part. And actually we don't have any work currently going on in the lab right now on that. But it's one of the biggest challenges I think in the space. And all these parts come together to make novel biocatalysts. So these are novel strains or microbes. Could be anything from an E. coli, a yeast, CHO cells, or eukaryotic cells for different biomedical applications to really address different market segments. So one is bioenergy. So these are different types of biofuels or fuel additives that we're considering making or making in the lab based on in the bioenergy sector. Chemicals, which would be bulk chemicals, specialty chemicals, so things that go into all the materials that we use today. Therapeutics, so these would be things like natural products, anti-cancer agents, antimicrobials, you name it. Most 75% of all the drugs we use today are themselves or are derived or inspired from natural products. And then even advanced materials, so nanomaterials, self-assembled materials, things like that, right? So I'll talk most about today would be the bioenergy and the chemicals. The other stuff tends to go more into the biomedical applications. So my path so far, how did I get to Duke? So I've been here about a little over 2 years on campus since, and basically I've had an interesting past, so I'll tell you a little bit about that. So back in 2000, I did my undergraduate in biomedical engineering and anthropology. Figure out how I went to chemical engineering, I have no idea. I did a master's degree working on protein engineering and enzyme engineering at the design level with Carolyn Marshall at WashU. And then I went to Colorado, as was mentioned, to do my MD PhD at the University of Colorado Health Science Center and the PhD in chemical engineering in the Department of Chemical Engineering in Boulder. And that was with Professor Gill, who's still there at the chemical engineering department today. And some of the work that we did in the lab that as part of my PhD and my postdoc basically spawned out some intellectual property that was used to start a company called OPX Biotechnologies, which I was at from 2007 to 2012. Basically leading the technology development, going through all the aspects of entrepreneurship. And one of the major projects we had at OPX was basically to make renewable diapers. So got a little baby there with a diaper, right? So some of the chemicals that go into diapers are really an environmental concern. They're usually produced from petroleum, have a lot of byproducts, environmental impact. So we're trying to make those from renewable sugar sources, right? And then after that company was recently sold last year, I moved on to Duke in the transition, going back to academia, but also doing some entrepreneurial things. So we've just started a company last year out of some technology out of Duke called DMC, which is up and going for the last year and doing pretty well as far as a year-old company can do. Right? So this is one of the questions I often get asked is why did I go to a company and then why do I come back to academia, right? So I said, why did the academic cross the road? If you're in a company and you have an academic visit you, usually you're asking you want a handout, right? You want some money to do something, you want a sponsored research agreement. Or people who from academia who go to industry looking for jobs think that they're going to have more impact. It's going to be more translatable, right? I'm going to have broader impact in industry than I will in academia. And this is the big one, I think, that drives a lot of decisions in terms of why you go into industry versus academia, is to make more money, right? So you go over, and that's what we did. We started OPX, and I ended up in industry, right? That was founded in May 2007, and as I mentioned, it was really on renewable chemicals, which is a multi-billion-dollar market, taking, in that case, renewable corn sugar and renewable cane sugar, making chemicals via fermentation, and then those go into a host of different consumer products, so paints, diapers, as I mentioned, detergents, soaps, things like that. Right? So OPX was a great experience, and basically ended in 2015 when Cargill, if you're not familiar with Cargill, they have a lot of sugar. That's why they were interested in OPX. Bought us, and primarily not for the diapers, but for fatty acid molecules that go into detergents and soaps and things like that. So then I said, okay, why did I go back across the road to Duke, right? So that you've had an experience in startup, people say you don't usually go back. And really, people said why, and I say, well, is it more innovative science? That can be one reason. You know, when you're in a company, you have very specific goals and deliverables. To have more fun, that's one potential reason. And this is something I always say, I dream of a day when you can go back and forth from industry to academia without having your motivations questioned. Because I think the reality is, it doesn't really matter what side of the road you're on. The question isn't which side of the road you're on, it's where is the road going, right? So I think, try to focus on that, at least I try to focus on that, and I try to focus on what is the fastest way or the best way to get to where you're going. So sometimes that's an industrial partnership, sometimes that's being in industry, sometimes that's being in academia. So you have to pick what's best for you at the time, right? And so where is the road going for energy? So big picture view is energy use and impact, right? And where biology fits in. So we use a lot of energy. And I hate to say it, but the US uses more than anybody else by far. So the road we're on. So as David mentioned, we're basically have increased over the last 50 years fourfold the amount of energy we use annually. So we're at 100 quadrillion BTUs currently. And that's sort of flatline, but expected to increase. So what is that, 100 quadrillion BTUs? Quadrillion is a big number, right? So one 4-inch kitchen match, if you burn it completely, is 1 BTU, roughly, right? So that's 10 to the 17th kitchen matches burned a year to generate the energy that the US uses, right? So that's equivalent to an 11-foot tall block of wood the size of the state of North Carolina being burned every year by the US to generate the energy that we consume, right? So that's not only a lot of energy that we use, and it's different sources, but it's also a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, as you can imagine, right? If you burn a match, think about how much CO2 you get. This is how much CO2 you get. You're burning the state of North Carolina, right? But this is really not really the whole picture, right? If you think about the fact that we're just the US and we burn that much. And the rest of the world is developing, and the standard of living in the rest of the world isn't where it is for us. And I think that would be one goal I think the society we have is that everyone comes to the same high level of standard of living, right? So if you have to take a population of 320 and you apply the same energy use that we have, 320 million in the US, to the 7.2 growing billion population in the world, you're talking about burning half the United States in terms of a block of wood the size of half of the continental US every year, right? So that is a lot of energy, right? So I don't have all the solutions to this problem, right? This is a big problem. But I think it's a magnitude of scope that is worth considering when you think about any particular solution that you want to focus on, right? So this is a breakdown. I think David went through this. I'll just go through really briefly. So fossil fuels make up about 82% of that, right? And if you go back far enough, you can say those are all biologically produced. Yep.
Is that renewables and clean hydro?
Yep. There you go. So of the fossil fuels, it's coal, natural gas. This is 2014 numbers. There's a little bit of wiggle in there if you look at the last 5 years. Natural gas is about 30%. Petroleum is about 35%. Nuclear is about 8.5%. And then you have hydroelectric, geothermal, solar PV, which is, David mentioned, is really below 0.5%. Wind pushing up to 2%. The things you hear about a lot are solar or wind, right? The impact is really small. And then biomass, both from biomass and biofuels, is about 5%. And people say, well, that seems like a lot, but think about how much gas you use, and 10% of that's ethanol, right? So that's corn ethanol that we use in the US. That's basically all made from fermentation of biomass. And that's supplemented by almost mandatory to reduce the emissions in gasoline, right? So that's sort of what we use. Where does it go? So petroleum, biomass, and natural gas I consider a little bit differently because they're not only used for energy, they're also used for materials, right? So you have the things on the bottom, which are electricity and heating, mostly electricity, right? So that's the hydro, the wind, the PV, the nuclear, the coal, right? And then you have the things on top, which basically go to two sectors. One is liquid fuels, I mean, this is a gross exaggeration, but a generality. And then the other is chemicals, which is 7 to 10% of the amount of energy we use go to the bulk chemicals for all the materials that we use and export worldwide annually in the US. And then the other interesting thing is that of that electricity and heating, 3 to 5%, depending on who you believe, is going to wastewater treatment. So if you look at directly where biological processes are involved in our energy system right now, not considering the fact that all fossil fuels eventually came from biological systems, you're talking about 10% or so, 3 to 5 for the wastewater treatment, which is a complete biological process for the cleanup of sewage, and then the biofuels fermentation process. So that's a lot. So 10% roughly around what we use goes through some bioprocess, right? So I got a lot of people saying, oh, bioprocesses don't have any role in energy, and I think that we use them more today in energy than we use a lot of other technologies, right? But how do you prioritize if you're going to improve biological processes? Where do you prioritize your efforts? And this is kind of the arrows that I look at, converting different types of feedstocks to different types of products. So we have projects right now primarily working at biomass, going to liquid fuels, but also go to higher value chemicals. Talk about that in a second. Converting natural gas via biological means to both liquid fuels and chemicals. So think about gas to liquids technologies like they have in Saudi Arabia. They're billion dollar capital infrastructures to convert natural gas to petroleum, basically. There's a concept that biological processes can do that at a much smaller scale, lower capital requirements. And then in addition, there's also the possibility of using renewable electricity, whether that's from solar, wind, other sources, and waste carbon dioxide to convert those to chemicals and fuels, right? So it's electrofuels concept. Right? So these are kind of areas that I've worked on in the past or we're currently working on in the lab. And I think one of the things that I always say is we did a lot of work on chemicals production, and that's for this following reason, right? So bulk chemicals, right? They use 7 to 10% annually of the energy of the US, right? To make the chemicals that we have, but are responsible for almost a quarter of the greenhouse gas emissions. And that's not just because of the CO2, right? But it's also because everything that's not CO2, that's a worse greenhouse gas, comes from the chemical industry, right? So basically it's 5 times as much on a per energy use basis. So if you're talking about how much energy you use, the average greenhouse gas emission per BTU is on the left relative to 1, and the chemicals industry, which is all the shirts we have, the buttons, the plastic, the car, all the stuff that we love to have, which is, I like having it too, it counts for 5 times as much in terms of on a per BTU basis. So for me, this is a real area, I think, for several different reasons where you can focus. You can make an impact on the emissions and on the environmental impact in the energy sector, replacing the whole barrel of oil. But also, I think, this is one area where I think biological processes potentially have an advantage because the value is not in the energy. It's in the molecules, it's in the chemistry, it's in what they can do, right? So the matter and the physical entity that you're converting it to is where the value is. That's what you're selling, right? So there's structural and functional complexity. And it's a little bit differently than basing everything off a kilowatt hour or BTU, right? So you have a little bit higher of a margin, is basically what that means, right? And then you can make more money off of that, right? Which is why there's a more translation opportunity for some of these biological processes in the chemical industry. So some of the projects now in the lab that we're working on, based off some of this prioritization, one is something we call dynamic metabolic control. So some of the issues we have right now with the world of biology and making different things is you can theoretically make a lot of things, and the problem is how do you do that in a standardized way? So the Department of Defense is funding a lot of work right now into what they're calling living foundries. So how do you really design biology to do exactly what you want, right? So through that program, we basically developed a standardized process that makes whatever you want the same way. So you can envision having one type of plant that you build and you scale up that can be turned basically to make whatever molecule you want, right? Without having to build a whole new plant, right? So capital costs go down, you can have more flexibility, you can think about having an integrated biorefinery. So how we're doing that is basically instead of making organisms that like to grow and make what you want, we're basically having organisms that grow, and then we basically mess up their metabolism, we take out parts we don't want dynamically, we put other parts in, and we turn that organism that's growing into a factory to make what we want. And we do that dynamically. So what you can see here is how we do that is we do it with a nutrient that turns on and off these systems. So the cells grow, which is the black line, and then they consume a nutrient. When that nutrient is gone, basically they turn over their metabolism and they can start making products, right? So this is what that looks like. It's at the gene level, but it's also at the enzyme level, and we can basically make a lot of different products in the same process. So what you see here is some real data that we have from the lab. So this titer is the concentration of the product in the broth, so how much we're making. The biomass is the red line, that black line, so that's how many cells we're making. And these are a bunch of different products that we've been making. As the biomass stops growing, we start to make these different products. And that's the time is fermentation. And we've done more than 15, actually more than that now to date. And where do these products go? So they go to a variety of different places. So anywhere from rubbers, plastics, adhesives, nutrition, some specialty monomers as well in there. So there's sort of a flexibility, but also a lot of potential applications we can take to go to a lot of different routes. So that's one of the projects. It's a little more mature in the lab. The other one that's just getting started, that's actually funded from the Energy Initiative seed funding, is actually looking at mining metabolic diversity to find new biological routes to make new interesting things or to use carbon dioxide. Right? So there's a whole lot of organisms out there that we're finding left and right. We don't know what they do. They live in strange environments. So this is a collaboration with Amy Schmidt in biology, who works on archaeal species and extremophiles, to try to understand how do we rapidly go into these different systems, identify the enzymes and genes that could be useful for making products, biofuels, and even fixing CO2, and put them together into novel pathways to make new things. Right? So one of the other projects. And the last project I'll talk about basically is more on the natural gas, hydrogen side of things. So this is more toward that replacing Fischer-Tropsch or gas to liquid, large-scale gas to liquid, biological gas to liquids. And the concept here is to use natural gas or possibly renewable electron sources and combine those with carbon dioxide into a process that basically makes your product of interest, and doing that with what we call a recyclable electron carrier. So basically add the electrons from the natural gas or from the hydrogen to this carrier. The carrier is fed to the cells. The cells extract the energy out of that. They convert the CO2 and that energy to the product you want. And then they spit out the oxidized carrier, which then you can add electrons to in a chemical process. Right? So this concept is particularly attractive for certain types of chemicals that have where the carrier is sort of linked to what you're trying to make, but theoretically flexible for a lot of different things. And could be using electrons from renewable sources, but also from natural gas. As mentioned, I think, several times today. If it didn't come up, you probably already know it. Natural gas is so cheap that you can't compete with it, right? You might as well get on the bandwagon or, be left behind. So those fuels and chemicals could be anything again, right? So they could be biofuels, they could be plastics, adhesives, specialty chemicals, et cetera. So with that, I'll take questions.